Welcome back to another episode of Christian Natural Health. Today, I'm very pleased to have Gisela Kreglinger, who grew up on a winery in Franconia, Germany, where her family has been crafting wine for many generations. She holds two master's degrees in biblical studies from Regent College and a PhD in historical theology from the University of St. Andrews. She teaches Christian spirituality in the academy churches on her annual wine pilgrimages, and every time an opportunity opens up around the dinner table, preferably with a glass of well-crafted wine to inspire her musings on food, faith, and the importance of cultivating joy and conviviality. She is the author of Cup Overflowing, Wine's Place in the Faith, Feasting and Fellowship, The Spirituality of Wine, and The Soul of Wine. Welcome, Gisela. So pleased to have you with us.
Lauren, it is wonderful to be with you.
Yeah, for sure. So, we're going to talk today about wine's place in scripture, clearly. So, why? I mean, I assume that the reason why you were inspired to do this is because of your background, where you were so immersed in wine growing up. So, I assume, became passionate about that and then wanted to see the overlap, or tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I grew up on a winery in Bavaria, and
Uh-huh.
I grew up in the Lutheran Church.
Okay.
So, in the context that I grew up, faith and wine were always deeply interwoven.
Yeah.
And, my family has been making wine for the Lord's Supper for many generations.
Uh-huh.
And I remember very vividly my mother during harvest time going out into the vineyard and cutting off branches with beautiful grape cluster to take to the church to decorate the altar for harvest Thanksgiving service. And there was always this very deep sense that the world of wine and the winery and agriculture that I grew up in the
Yeah.
world of faith,
Uh-huh.
belong together.
Uh-huh.
And then I grew up with a tasting room. We had a tasting room. People came every day to taste wines, and then there were wine tastings and celebrations and gatherings all the time. And I just witnessed from a very early age how Germans can be very serious, a little uptight, and um, how gathering together and sampling wine, how that would just transform the whole group
Uh-huh.
from fairly, quiet, uptight, the sense of, we try to give this air that we have it all together.
Sure.
And then with every wine, people would relax. The would come more quickly, and confessions came more easily. Confessions of both delight and joy, but
Sure.
also confessions of failure and loss. And there was this both joyous momentum, I call it conviviality,
Mhm.
but also the vulnerability that came.
Mhm.
It wasn't about getting drunk and shutting down. It actually opened people's lives up,
Right.
and they opened up to one another, and beautiful conversations emerged. And so that was just so deeply, deeply ingrained in me. And, I thought that was normal. Everyone grew up that way. But
Sure. Yeah.
and then, when I studied abroad, I studied theology at Regent College in Vancouver, and then I taught at a seminary in the American South where alcohol was not allowed.
Right.
And I was just, so surprised. And I felt there was something missing. I felt our faculty meetings were always so formal and stiff, and people, try to get away as soon as they could. Well,
Sure.
where I grew up, you get together, even in academic context, and
Sure.
then
Everybody's having a good
then
time.
you start conversations, and then you start arguing about things, and then you have another glass of wine, and people leave, and they really hash out their arguments, and they're not
Sure.
afraid to sort of,
Yeah. Drop that inhibition a little
through. And
bit.
I felt like there was just a depth of knowing, a depth of vulnerability, a depth of celebration, a depth of community that I think is lacking.
Sure.
And so I think, and then in the theology, when I studied theology, I was like, wow, this is very much about the intellectual ascent.
Mhm.
And I felt that there was so much missing, and no one talked about wine. And wine is the most talked about food in the Bible.
Mhm.
There are nearly 1,000 references to wine and wine-related themes. It is
Yeah.
woven throughout Scripture, and I'm like, why is no theologian talking about that? I mean, there were little studies done, maybe a little bit about wine in the Bible, or, in the North America, more why wine is non-alcoholic in the Bible.
Mhm.
Things like that, which is of course not true. Archaeology
That's
tells
ridiculous.
us very clearly that it wasn't. But of course,
Sure.
there's history to why people did
Right.
that,
Oh,
very
sure.
traumatic history. And I talk about that in my book, Cup Overflowing.
Yeah.
And so I really felt that at some point I wanted to fill that gap. I enjoy writing about things that no one has written about, or
Yeah.
areas like my PhD was on George MacDonald as a theologian, and they
Oh, nice.
have written about that. And
Sure.
so I like doing that. So I felt like um, having grown up on a family winery, and I've always had a deep faith. I
Hmm.
think I've always asked hard questions.
Hmm.
I always, was so frustrated. I said, if God created the world and everything is good, well,
Hmm.
where does the snake come from? And where
Right.
does the dark, I mean, those are the kind of
Sure.
questions that I would ask as a
Yeah.
child. I
Right.
think God put things in me when I was very young. And so as I, became a theologian and I taught Christian spirituality, I realized that this is a unique opportunity for me because I understand both the world of wine, which is very complex, and
Hmm.
the world of theology. It's
Sure.
very complex. And there are actually a lot of parallels.
Right.
There's a reason why wine is used to talk about the kingdom.
Hmm. Yeah.
So
So
that
let's use that as a jumping off point. So you already alluded to wine being part of the Lord's Supper, and you guys were involved in that. I think almost every church that I've ever been in uses juice, not wine. But can you tell us a little bit about why that element was used for the symbolism of Jesus' blood?
um, wine has always been in the great civilization considered to be a very valuable drink
Hmm.
because of its potential for beauty
Hmm.
and complexity. And I think what it does, it shapes communities, it shapes civilizations. That's how conversations happen. That's how imaginative collaboration happens. So even in the biblical worldview, wine was also understood as something very esteemed.
Hmm.
From very early on, when the patriarchs spoke blessings over their children to pass on God's blessing,
Yeah.
wine was included in that. In that, that shows you how aware they were that wine is something very important for God shaping a people,
Hmm.
because it adds an incredible dimension of beauty, of conviviality, of culture, I think. And so, when the spies, um, when Moses was at the border of the promised land and sent out the spies, they were sent out during harvest time, and they came to the valley of Eschol, the valley of the grape cluster.
Hmm.
And the spies brought back a massive grape cluster on a pole. And that was a sure sign that this land was blessed by God. So you have to keep that in mind,
Right.
that there was already this understanding that wine was a very, very special drink, unlike a beer. And that's what was very desirable about the promised land.
Hmm.
And so when they settled into the land, they started growing, vines and vineyards. And there was this ideal vision, that every family could sit under their own vine and fig tree and have a modest abundance. So it
Hmm.
was a vision not of grand landowners and massive productions, but humble realities that provided a modest abundance for celebrations. So I think that's an important background to have. And so when by the time of Jesus, when the Israelites celebrated the Passover meal, for example, which is the foundation, of course, for the Lord's Supper, by his time, 4 cups of wine were included to retell and to reenact the story of the Exodus and how God delivered his people out of bondage and brought them to the promised land. And so the wine really both helped to tell the story, but also helped them to enter into that joyful celebration,
Hmm.
even at a time when they were occupied by the Romans.
Right.
But they needed to cultivate that remembrance of God is our Savior, and
Right.
to celebrate that hope that He's with them in the present and that He will deliver them once more.
Sure.
And so the prophets, the prophets had talked about God's deliverance and that He would send a Messiah, and something that would accompany the Messiah was feasting and wine flowing down the mountains. This would be a sign that God would be present and bring salvation once more.
Right.
So when Jesus steps onto the scene, and I want to start with maybe the wedding feast,
Sure.
the first miracle that he performs is at a wedding feast. And the prophets had talked about, this wedding feast, this great feast between God, our bridegroom,
Mhm.
and his people as the bride.
Mhm.
And so when Jesus performs this first miracle and reveals his glory, God's glory, he addresses those hopes of the prophets that had spoken about the Messiah, the anointed one who would save them once more. So
Mhm.
already we see in this miracle that Jesus uses the bounty of creation in the beautiful gift of wine to speak about who he is and what he has come to do. So salvation is spoken of in terms of an abundance of wine. So salvation is not just to get into the door
Mhm.
of God's people. This is about life
Mhm.
that flourishes, a life where we can celebrate that we're God's people and rejoice that God is with us. It's
Mhm.
not just about surviving. The Christian life is about so much more.
Mhm.
And so when Jesus, lifts up the cup at the Passover meal
Mhm.
and then says to his disciples, "This is the blood shed for you, the blood of the covenant," and reinterprets it in light of his own blood shed. I think he elevates this already very precious gift to new heights, um,
Mhm.
that we taste the goodness of God in shedding Christ's blood in wine. And the whole winemaking process parallels so beautiful the work that Christ has done on the cross.
Mhm.
Just like grapes need to be crushed,
Mhm.
pressed, and transformed, so Christ is crushed on the cross
Mhm.
and died, and his death is being transformed into resurrection life.
Mhm.
So it's really an incredibly powerful reality, wine in the winemaking process, to always take us into this precious sacrifice that Christ has given, and to allow us to enter into that great mystery, both in the suffering and death, but also in the resurrection power, in the beauty, in the abundance of life that Christ wants to bring to us. So
Mhm.
I think this is something that we haven't really theologically talked about a lot. And most people, when they go to the Lord's Supper, even in churches where they are served wine, it's not talked about. It's a rich, rich tradition of Christian mystics that have talked about them drinking from the Eucharistic cup and having these incredible revelations in
Mhm.
the body, in an
Mhm.
embodied way, about what Christ has done for them.
Mhm.
Beautiful reflections. Bernard of Clairvaux, a Cistercian mystic from Burgundy, is one of them. So I think we've sort of, because I think the Protestant tradition in particular is all about sort of the intellectual assent. You
Yeah.
know, we think by thinking through things and by thinking it in our minds, we're actually grasping it. But we need to grasp it with our body. We need to grasp it with the very fibers of our bodies. And this is why Christ invites us to receive the forgiveness of sin and the healing of our lives through bread and
Mhm.
wine. It's not just about an idea that we mull over in our head. It's something that we take into our bodies and let, just like wine and bread are taken into our bodies and transformed into nourishment,
Mhm.
so is Christ's blood and his presence here, so that we can deeply take it into ourselves and allow the Spirit to transform us and
Mhm.
heal us and set us free
Mhm.
into this abundant and beautiful life of salvation that Christ wants to offer us.
Yeah. And God is so big into symbolism. There's so many things where, and all of the parables are illustrations of this as well, where there's something that's very practical and tangible that we can identify with, and it's used as an analogy for some greater spiritual reality. And it
Yeah.
sounds like wine is definitely one that is interwoven throughout scripture. I want to come back to something you just said a little bit back about how when the reenactment of the first Passover has 4 glasses of wine. I wasn't aware of this. Can you expound on that a little bit more?
Yeah, there we do have from that period when Jesus lived, we do have writings that mention that 4 cups of wine were used
Okay.
over the course of an evening. They would retell and reenact the Exodus story. It
Okay.
wasn't just sort of a quick thing. They
Mhm.
probably spent hours, preparing. I mean,
Sure, yeah.
they would bring their sacrificial offerings
Mhm.
to the sacrifice, and then the lamb that was then slaughtered at the temple, and then they would bring it. And how the disciples and Jesus, they prepared the Passover meal, that there were lots of preparation. And then they really spend probably a very long evening, retelling the story. And then 4 cups of wine were included in that. And that's quite well known.
Mhm.
And even today, when you go to Passover celebrations, you will be served wine, and then they would leave one wine cup
Mhm.
at the end of the Passover meal for the prophet Elijah, because
Oh, okay.
they were hoping that
That's the
God
right.
would send,
Yeah.
that Elijah would come or another Messiah would come, and Jesus really has taken on that role. But
Uh-huh.
even Jesus, when he celebrates the Lord's Supper, does something very similar. He says, I will not drink again of this cup of wine
Mhm.
until I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom.
Mhm.
Again, you have this eschatological hope, this hope for the future, that the work that Christ has begun
Mhm.
will be complete at the end of time, when Christ will return, and there will be a great feast,
Mhm.
and Christ will wipe away all the tears from our eyes. And
Mhm.
so we need to cultivate that hope once more. And
Mhm.
Christ offers us a cup of wine to
Mhm.
cultivate hope that God has not abandoned this world. Sometimes it feels that way with all the turmoil going on, but God has not abandoned this world. And
Mhm.
so when we think about drinking a glass of wine, always use it as a way to cultivate that hope that
Mhm.
Christ, who has begun this good work, he will complete it at
Mhm.
the end of time. So I
Absolutely.
think that's beautiful. Again, it's not just sort of this this idea in our heads. It's something that we need to experience with our whole bodies, that hope and that joy
Mhm.
for the fulfillment of things in the future.
Mhm. So the traditional view in, I mean, not every denomination, but there's a lot of them that do forbid it and don't drink at all. So I assume the majority of this is just because of the potential risk of drunkenness. So they're trying to overcorrect. Is that true, or is there more to it than that?
This is a great, great question, Lauren. And I actually, in Cup Overflowing, I address this. This is a book for the North American context to help North Americans understand their particular with history with alcohol and the prohibition.
Right.
Now, the prohibition was something very particular to the United States. It wasn't happening in Europe.
Hmm.
And I mean, it also happened in Britain. And so here is what happened when the Pilgrims came to North America on the East Coast. They couldn't plant vineyards. They wouldn't take. The climate wasn't suitable for it. So distilled spirits became the primary drink of Americans.
Oh,
And
okay.
so when America came of age, the Industrial Revolution was happening. And for the first time in human history, they were able to mass produce distilled spirits and make it readily available
Mhm.
to the general population. And that was not a good thing, because in times of crisis and
Sure.
the people got, it's so much easier to get really, really drunk on distilled spirits, but that became and still is such a primary drink in the US.
I
And
have
so
done. I have a dumb question. So, distilled spirits, I know wine is fermented grapes. What
Yeah.
is the definition of a distilled spirit?
So what you do with this distilled spirits, it's for
Yeah.
example grain,
Okay, that's what I
from
thought. Right.
grain
Sure.
or from sugar beets or whatever, that will be fermented, and then the mash will then come into a distillery,
Uh-huh.
and that's where through evaporating, with the fermentation, this alcohol
Right.
exists, and then
So it
by heating
concentrates.
it up, it evaporates, and
Uh,
then you distill it out, and then you have a very high percentage of alcohol in the
that's why.
beverage.
Okay, so the percent of alcohol is dramatically higher. That's why it's easier to get drunk on it, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So yeah. So with whiskey and brandy, you can have 50% alcohol. I mean, obviously they water it down, but when
Yeah,
it comes out of the distillery,
sure.
it can be near to 100%.
I
So,
see.
and
Okay,
that's very, very that can be very destructive. And
sure.
so I think this country, America, came of age on distilled spirits, and that's what created a lot of havoc.
Okay.
And the temperance movement first started in response to the abuse of distilled spirits and not wine.
Oh,
So that's really
interesting.
important.
Yeah.
Wine was only included later, but and then of course the prohibition didn't last that long, but the effects of it in this country were really severe.
Mm.
And the idea that wine was non-alcoholic in the Bible only came about in that period.
Oh,
That
that
was
makes sense.
not, that's a very modern idea. But
Right.
you have to realize that a lot of trauma happened because of the abuse of alcohol
Sure.
and destruction that it brought to families. So a lot of people that still wrestle with that, they usually have trauma in the family.
Right.
And I live in the American South, and there's hardly any family that has not been impacted by alcohol abuse of one kind or another.
Right. Uh-huh.
So it is still a very, very current reality that we need to deal with.
Sure.
And in this culture, we have really not developed the wisdom that a culture can and should like to have in mind around what kind of alcohol is good to drink regularly,
Right.
when are the times, what are the rituals that we should do that, and then also what are the boundaries around it.
Yes, absolutely. Uh-huh.
And that's again something that I've tried to address in my book Cup Overflowing. I added an appendix because I think we need to, as a church and families, we need to talk about that.
Right.
We need to talk about. I'm very, very cautious about distilled spirits. Now, I grew up on a winery, and
Right.
my father actually had a distillery.
Okay.
We made schnapps from pears, apples, plums, and such, but we only drank it very sparingly.
Mhm.
And there were strict regulations from the government on how much schnapps can be produced.
Mhm.
And I
Okay.
think that's a really wise thing.
Hmm.
When you look at the history, for example, in Scotland, they also got out of control with their whiskey distilleries once they had the technology to drink more, and the
Right.
Scots became very, very heavy drinkers. And then the government, put heavy taxes on it, and it worked. People
Yeah.
went.
Hmm.
But anyhow, this is sort of the history of this country, and I think we need to sort of understand this particular history. It was an unfortunate combination that happened. They couldn't plant, the pilgrims wanted to plant vineyards because wine is a really good alcoholic drink. Thomas Jefferson, you know, saw that when he was an ambassador in France at the beginning of the French Revolution.
Hmm.
French didn't get drunk,
Hmm. Yeah.
and he was trying so hard to get viticulture going, and he just wasn't able to do it because of the climate on the East Coast. Of course, today it's a very different situation.
Sure. Yeah.
So I think this is a time to have this kind of a conversation and to say, okay, what happened in our particular country? Why is our relationship with alcohol so tumultuous and
Hmm.
difficult?
Yeah.
Going from, extreme pendulum swings from
Right.
drinking it all to overindulging, again, not
Sure.
not drinking it all to overindulging. And so my hope was with my book Cup Overflowing is to say, let's talk about it. And
Yeah.
then let's, as communities, as families, communities,
Mhm.
as a society, let's make this a public conversation and then say there are good ways forward. There are
Yeah.
good ways to think about how to include wine in a very healthy and wholesome wine, and how to teach children to be careful with distilled spirits.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
That's and I think if we have that conversation like we're having today, Lauren, we bring it out into the open, I think a lot of families are relieved
Mm-hmm.
because
Sure.
it's there.
Yeah.
Think about all the, I mean, I don't have my own children, but in North America, children can only start drinking when they are 21.
Mhm.
They will be at college with their peer. That is not a great place to learn
Sure.
how to enjoy wine responsibly. And then the kind of alcohol they drink is not healthy or good.
Uh-huh.
It's cheap liquor. People get drunk, and it's like we need to help families say no. And the church too. I think the church
Yeah.
has always been called to be prophetic.
Mm-hmm.
We are meant to show the world how to live, how God intended it.
Yep.
Well, God gave the gift of wine. So
Mhm.
we really should be thinking hard about, okay, what is this gift? Why it is so prominent in
Right.
the Bible and in the history of the
Right.
Christian church? And then what does it mean to embrace it in healthy and wholesome ways? And then show the culture how to do it.
Sure. Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. So, for somebody that has a history of struggling with this, what would you say to somebody who's like, okay, I recognize that this is a good gift that God gave, and I want to have some experience with it. What boundaries did you grow up with? What did you see modeled for you that would help you to recognize this is too far and maybe not have the desire or the temptation to cross that line?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great question. And again, I have written that in an
Yeah.
appendix in Cup
Uh-huh.
Overflowing. But one of the really important things is that we don't drink before 5 p.m. usually.
Okay. Yeah.
So I know in France they do it differently, but in Germany, where I am from, we
Yeah.
don't usually drink before 5 p.m. Of course, on a Sunday or a special celebration
Maybe.
after church, mom would make a roast and we would have some wine with the roast, and then we would all take a nap and then go for a walk.
Yeah.
That was our Sunday routine, you
Yeah.
know?
Uh-huh.
So, but, and so we wouldn't drink before 5 p.m. and certainly not every day.
Sure.
And and then we would share wine.
Mm-hmm.
Wine was always something that we shared, and we sat together around the table with food.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it was associated with a certain lifestyle.
Right.
And I think that's really important. And because, we received wine in the Lord's Supper in the church, I always understood that that's something very special. And there
Mm-hmm.
have been studies done that show that children who are socialized into drinking wine in a religious or family context are
Mm-hmm.
less likely to abuse it.
Which makes perfect sense. Yeah. It's the whole forbidden fruit thing, right? If you're
Yeah,
told that you can't
yeah,
have something until a
yeah.
certain age, then it's got a mystique to it that it won't otherwise, potentially.
And we are withholding the gifts of God for his
Mm-hmm.
people.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you do it in a wholesome way, together in celebrations, it
Mm-hmm.
can really elevate meals to special celebrations and bring joy and conviviality and laughter
Yeah.
in really, really beautiful ways. So, that's what I grew up with. And I thought, oh, I didn't, people didn't come to the winery to get drunk. And
Right.
in our culture, there was this understanding you don't drink before 5. And people who did, you were like, okay, that's not right.
Sure.
And and then also there was within the culture, it was we have these wine festivals during the summertime,
Yeah.
these medieval villages that we go to, and there's a little bit of traditional music playing, and people sit together, they have some wine, they have some food, and they just enjoy a good time together. And
Yeah.
so these are the kind of rituals and practices that really taught us as children that is a good thing and we enjoy it, but there are boundaries around it.
Sure. And I don't know if you talk about this in any of your books, but the concept of the centenarian cultures, where so many of them include wine as part of the traditional experience.
Yeah.
I am assuming, like, people will speculate that this is resveratrol because it's antioxidant and all the rest of it. And I'm sure there's probably something to that. But I wonder to what extent it's the fact that it becomes the social lubricant and it
Yeah.
creates that community. What's your take on that?
Well, the resveratrol question is, they have done studies on mice and fed them a lot of resveratrol, and that's what the, that's when the health benefits come in. You'd have
Right.
to drink a lot of
No.
wine.
For that to really
So
be big.
I mean, there are compounds in wine that are, I think, very good. It's very different from beer or distilled spirits, but I think it's hard to unpack that.
Mhm.
Um, and I think, I mean, of course, in the medical research, they're trying to do that, and there's so many contradictory
I know
studies
there
done.
are. Yeah.
But I think that's really important to realize that the health benefits, and you mentioned that go beyond what the sciences can sort of trace through observation in the body.
Right.
It looks at, for example, wine can be really beautiful.
Hmm.
You enjoy beauty,
Right.
something really positive for you to experience, and it will help your health.
Sure.
Um,
Absolutely.
joy, in Psalm 104. It says, God gave wine to make glad the
Mhm.
hearts of humanity. Now,
Right.
think about joy and laughter and how healthy that is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And the conviviality, yeah, and the social bonding in the community that happens. So I
Mhm.
think that all works together in organic ways
Sure.
to bring health and healing. And I think you're right that wine really is an invitation to the table. These people also eat healthy food.
Hmm.
I grew up. We
Right.
have a family garden. We always ate very, very healthily.
Hmm.
That is another part of the picture. If we want to think about health and healing, it's a holistic thing. And one aspect is food, another aspect is life around the table.
Right.
Um, Lauren, for the first time in human history, families do not eat together anymore.
Mm. Wow.
Think about that.
Yeah.
Think about all the things that happen at the table. That's where we learn what it means to be human.
Hmm.
This is where we learn how to be in conversation. This is where we learn how to be civil. This is where we learn how to have good arguments. This
Hmm.
is where we process our day.
Right.
This is where our family bonds are developed and strengthened so
Mm.
that you can then send your children out and they will have a certain um, sense of who they are and whom they belong to, and they can weather the storms of school and mobbing and all of these things so much better.
Yeah.
And so, when we talk about wine, we also need to talk about the table and to reclaim the
Right.
table.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I think you're right. It's an invitation to a life away from the screens, away from hectic lifestyles, away from too many activities for children,
Right.
to be together as families. And,
Hmm.
invite some strangers along or some people who are lonely, and then celebrate life and do it every day. Light a little candle to realize life around the table is sacred.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Processing your day and your emotions, and allowing that inner life to be really nurtured and developed rather than shutting it down
Hmm.
and sort of numbing yourself with various activities. That is not good for our mental health.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. So, and in medicine, there's a concept called hormesis. It's actually in pharmacology where the dose makes the poison is what that literally means, and it's where small amounts of a substance that are beneficial if you give large amounts of that same substance, then it becomes detrimental. So
Yeah.
some of the studies with respect to wine in particular show that there's essentially like a U-shaped curve where if you don't drink at all, like then you're kind of at a certain risk factor. If you drink a little bit, and that little bit varies by the study, your risk actually goes down for a lot of various different types of chronic disease.
Yeah.
And then once you start drinking excessively, the risk goes up dramatically as well.
Yeah.
So there's that sweet spot, just like what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think that's very, very important. It's about, we drink wine regularly. And
Right.
I used to, I am 57 now. I used to be able to sort of drink 2 glasses of wine, not every day, but for a special occasion. But
Sure.
now I realize, I'm getting older, my body can't handle it as well. So I just drink 1 glass a day. And
Mhm.
I think that's really, moderation has always been important. And I think that's what the Bible also encourages is this moderate amount. But you
Mhm.
also have to realize that, like with any other food,
Right.
you not only a lot of medical studies don't distinguish between distilled spirits, beer, and wine,
Oh,
but
yeah.
then also they don't distinguish between organic wine, biodynamic wine, and commercially produced wine.
Mhm.
Commercially produced wine, all the pesticides and herbicides,
Sure,
and then
yeah.
all the additives. I don't drink that wine because I know my husband had cancer,
Oh,
and he's doing well.
good.
We are very, very thoughtful about the kind of food and groceries that we buy. We
Mhm.
buy our meat from a regenerative farmer. We
Right.
have local organic farmers that we buy our produce from. And we don't go out a lot. When we go out, we go to a farm to the table restaurant where we know the ingredients are good.
Yeah.
And so I think we just need to be mindful of that and learn about that, not just with wine, but
Mhm.
also with food in general, because there are so
Right.
many people ill. I mean, over 50 million Americans have an autoimmune disease.
Nuts.
I have been teaching at an honors college.
Mhm.
50% of those students were ill and
Mhm.
had intestinal problems. And when I look at their diet and what they eat on campus, it's all junk food.
Of course.
And we have normalized
Mhm.
food that slowly kills us.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, you've mentioned the commercially produced wine, and then you said organic wine, and then you said a third one. What was that? Biodynamic something?
A biodynamic wine. This is
Okay.
a approach to agriculture that takes organic
Yeah.
uh, a step further, and it looks at the interdependent community, not only of a farm,
Mhm.
but also, they work with the cycles of the moon
Oh,
in,
okay.
in terms of when they do certain things on the winery or the farm.
Uh-huh.
And there's also this spiritual dimension. It's a bit on the esoteric side, but
Sure.
I, as a theologian, like to engage with it because the world was created by God, therefore it is spiritual.
True.
Soil is a living organism
Hmm.
that is not just matter out there. In the biblical world, soil is spiritual.
Hmm. Yeah.
It is something that God created. And actually, the first human being in the Bible, Adam,
Hmm.
in Hebrew, it's Adam Adamah, means of the soil.
Oh, does it? I did not know
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Interesting.
So think about that, this close connection that we have in the soil. And so biodynamic is really a very fascinating approach to agriculture. And it's interesting that Burgundy, where I take my people on a wine pilgrimage, is that's where the monks and nuns really took off with viticulture and planting vineyards and having that part of their mission in the world. But it's also the region has really pioneered biodynamic viticulture, and the biodynamic wines are so much more vibrant. I
Really?
mean, yeah, it's we have a wine shop in town. Actually, I'm doing an event for them soon, and
Yeah.
they only have organic and biodynamic wines. The owners are Christians.
Yeah.
They want to help heal the earth. They want to help a younger generation teach, how to have
Hmm.
a glass of wine and some charcuterie and conversation. They create that kind of a cultural understanding in their wine shop. So
Very
I get to drink them quite a bit, and they are more expensive.
Yeah, I bet.
And so you don't drink a lot of it, but when
Right.
you do, it is wonderful.
You can tell.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. You alluded earlier to some of the spiritual insights of historical, monks and whatnot. You mentioned Bernard of Clairvaux. Can you tell that story? I'm curious.
So it really, the Benedictines
Hmm.
really took off in the sort of 10th century in Cluny, and they built this massive cathedral.
Hmm.
And, agriculture and planting vineyards was part of what Benedict had told them to do. You worship God, and then you do manual labor,
Hmm.
and you study, and they became massively successful and, also a little corrupt. And so there needed to be a reform movement, and that was the Cistercians.
Hmm.
And actually, I'm taking my wine pilgrims to Citeaux, where it all started.
Yeah.
And so they re-emphasized the importance of worship and agriculture, that every monk had to do manual labor.
Mm.
Sort of everyone is equal, like Christ had said. They wear the same outfit, they eat the same food, and they all do manual labor. And Benedict, had in his rule laid out this way of life that included agriculture. And really, it was the Benedictines and Cistercians, through their development of agriculture, they laid the agricultural foundation for Western civilization to emerge. Because if you don't have a
Sure. No, that
regular
makes
provision of food and drink,
right. Yeah,
you can't grow. And, the population just exploded.
sure.
And Bernard of Clairvaux was a he came from a very well-to-do family and decided to become a monk, and he was very charismatic. And so lots of young men followed him. Actually, they say that a lot of families, when Bernard of Clairvaux came into town, hid their young men because they didn't want them to follow Bernard. But
Sure.
he wrote beautiful, beautiful sermons on the Song of Songs. He grew up in the wine region, so he was very familiar with it. So the
Sure.
Song of Songs resonated deeply with him. But
Hmm.
the Cistercians, really developed the idea of the sort of the crew, that a certain parcel of land is more suitable for certain grape varieties, and they sort of perfected the wine growing idea. And for them, of course, crafting wine was an act of worship.
Hmm.
They wanted to make really beautiful wine to worship God. And then, of course, what else but really, really beautiful wine could hold the presence
Hmm.
of Christ, the blood of Christ. And so they contributed so much. And Burgundy, one of the most well-known wine regions, with some of the most expensive wines in the world, um, owe their understanding in their vineyards to those monks. And I take our pilgrims to Abbey Saint-Vivant, which was a satellite of Cluny, and those monks planted some of the most famous Grand Crus in the world. And it's vintners who are gathering all this money together to rebuild the abbey. And every year when we go back, they've added something new.
Oh, how
And
very
they want to make it into a cultural center, and I'm trying to convince them to make it into a spiritual center.
there we go. Oh,
Yeah.
that's fantastic. Very cool. So, what have I not asked you that you want to make sure you leave with our audience?
Um, I hold wine tastings as a spiritual practice.
Mhm.
And with every wine, I offer a little meditation. And I'd like to sort of leave you with the first one and the last one.
Mhm.
So usually we have around 6 wines. And the first one, I always start with: to drink is to pray. To binge drink is to sin. And the line between praying and sinning is sometimes a really fine one.
Fair enough. I can see that.
Yeah. And then I usually end with a sixth wine. I end with a saying that's from where I come from, and it goes like this: wine is God's way of kissing humanity.
That's beautiful. I love
Mhm,
it.
mhm.
So, where can people go to learn more about you?
Well, you can go to my website, either under the Spirituality of Wine or Gisela Kreglinger.
Uh-huh.
And we have this new video series come out called Wine in the Word
Uh-huh.
that I did together with Randy Frazee, who is a very seasoned pastor, also
Mhm.
passionate about wine.
Mhm.
And I think with this video series and the study guide, we really want to get that conversation out
Mhm.
into the Christian community and say, join us, discover this gift, but also learn how to embrace it well and how to develop the wisdom around a healthy and wholesome enjoyment of wine.
Yes, I love it. This has been such a unique conversation, Gisela. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Very, very nice to meet you, Lauren, and have this conversation. And do spread the good news in liquid form.
Amen.